r/no sleep. Posted by u/Shane, star 93. I'm a mugger and housebreaker, but there are rules even we need to obey. Let me start by saying for the record that I'm not writing this to try and get anyone's approval, sympathy or forgiveness. I've made peace with what I do and who I am, so you can save your judgment for someone who cares. That being said, I rob people for a living. It isn't the glamorous life my foster parents wanted for me, but I'm also not some creeping monster or ghoul. I'm a person just like you. In this particular line of work there are the obvious dangers of police, guard dogs, alarm systems and the usual stubborn victims that think their $20 is worth putting up a fight. Then there are the less obvious dangers. Things that can't really be described. I'm not the most educated person in the world, which is part of the reason I'm going against my own criminal code of ethics and posting this on the internet, so that anyone can make sense of what I saw. I've been involved in this trade since I was in trade school when I first met up with Marcus and the rest of the guys. I won't bore you with the details of my life, but I'm pretty much the kind of person you'd expect to find in a career like this. They were a couple years older than I was at the time and really took me under their wing. At the time I was broke as hell trying to hold down a job as a car washer, and I'd be damned if I was going to live with my foster parents for 2 more years. Before long I began hanging out with these guys. One of the dudes, let's call him Marcus, did some time with me in juvenile hall, so he vouched for me with the others. Before long we had a little scheme going on in an upscale neighborhood about 15 minutes drive away from our own community. This was the kind of place where yuppies and other upper middle class suburbanites laid their heads. It was a place where they were frightened enough to pay for automatic gates and CCTV cameras but not proactive enough to form a community watch. Their loss. We usually confronted drunken, rich kids on their way home after a night of partying or the late-night jogger or dog walker. These licks, robberies for you vanilla readers, were pretty easy. Most times we didn't even have to flash Marcus Beretta for them to give us everything. I can't quite explain it, but there's a certain thrill that comes with being able to intimidate someone into giving you their cash and valuables. Especially the kind of person that would have looked down on you otherwise. Anyways, the streets of this particular neighborhood were straight, crisscrossing avenues and streets with no curves on relatively flat land. Like you could stand at one end and see all the way to the other end if you looked carefully enough, meaning we could see the cops from a distance away, making our lives a lot easier. Not that police were a problem, as this area is relatively unpatrolled. One of the biggest problems we had was just a general drop in activity. On some nights the place could be a fucking ghost town. I mean dead silence, the lights to the houses and apartments perfectly off, with black buildings and silence as far as the eye could see along the streets. It was creepy. I meant you knew people were home, it's just, what were they doing in there? I don't know. Coming from a neighborhood like ours where there was always a television set on, loud music, a police siren and the occasional gunshot, it was kind of a shock that people actually lived like this. On one of my first licks Marcus explained to me that while this neighborhood is relatively quiet, sometimes things happen that can be dangerous, and made it a rule for all 3 of us who were part of our clique to be sober and alert anytime we hit the streets. I never understood the reason for this, but the older guys seemed to have a clearer idea than I did. I just followed their lead. I remember one night, we split up the way we did. With 2 guys at the top of the street and Marcus and I at the bottom. The 2 guys at the top served as spotters. They would hide behind a tree, a dumpster or parked car and tip us off via text when a potential victim was walking our way, while Marcus and I did the actual robbing. This night, we all were in position when I got a text from Bubbles, one of the spotters, that an old man was walking towards us. He also said the guy looked drunk out of his mind because of how he walked. It was unusual to get old people out at this hour, but I didn't think too much of it. Before long Marcus and I saw the silhouette of the old man lumbering towards us. He appeared to have on a plain white tuxedo and staggered from side to side. Bubbles wasn't joking, this boy is fucking gone, I whispered to Marcus. I half expected to hear a chuckle, but Marcus just stood there with his hooded parka on staring at the old man, his hand still clutching the pistol in his jeans. Get back in the drains, he ordered. If we move that far back we won't get him in time. Get back, he said more forcefully. I complied and we fell back into a large storm drain and waited for the man to pass. It felt like forever hiding in that cramped, stink train, but eventually the man passed us, walking as if controlled by an unseen puppet master, with one knee rising as high as his chest in front the other. Still in the drain, Marcus waited for the old man to be out of audible distance before he finally whispered something to me. I didn't tell you before because I wanted you to see one for yourself, but this neighborhood has had some experiences in the past. Not everything or every person you see here is good game. Sometimes you need to wait and see for yourself. Now try to bear in mind that Marcus was about 19 at the time of him telling me this. I knew a bit about him because his cousin and I did juvie together a few years ago. He had already done time for aggravated robbery and beating up his stepfather with a rake. He was the most solid guy I knew, but in that moment, in the storm drain surrounded by rat shit and leaves, I could see he looked genuinely scared. What do you mean? Like some of them pack heat? I asked curiously. His eyes still wide reflected the street lights. Nah. Just. Some of these people aren't what they seem. Shit, like I couldn't explain it, but after dark this neighborhood is a different place. I don't understand, I said softly. He shot me an annoyed look. Look man. That guy with the white suit. He isn't really a person. I don't think he is. Ever so often I see him walking up and down these streets the same way. If you get a good look at him you would see his face isn't right. Like his eyes and mouth. Shit. His features seem too far apart sometimes. I took a good look at Marcus to see if he was fucking with me. He was never the kind of guy to pull a prank on a job like this, so I trusted what he was saying is the truth. In all honesty, this entire neighborhood had a weird vibe to it from the first night we came here, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem like a pussy. I was the new guy after all. I eventually dropped the conversation just as Marcus called Bubbles and the other spotter at the top of the street. Tighten it up out there. The guy you told us about was white tux. Give us a heads up on some real people next time, fool. Real people? What the fuck did he mean by that? Before long I found out. After about an hour we got another text from Bubbles. This time it was a frantic one. Tall man S coming down the road, duck Marcus. Bubbles wasn't the most literate person, but on his best days at least I could understand his messages. This time I couldn't decipher what the fuck he was trying to say. I showed Marcus the message and he pushed me further into the storm drain. Shut the fuck up. Before I could ask a question I could see it through the grating of the drain. I wished I was high off some codeine because the bullshit I saw next would be a lot easier to explain. About 10 feet tall, I fucking saw my foster father tiptoeing down the avenue in front of us. Only it, had the biggest mouth I ever saw. My mouth fell open. A hoarse croak came out of my throat as I saw this thing doing a cartoonish tiptoe down the street, looking from side to side. I get shivers just thinking about it as I write it right now. How was that even possible? Obviously he wasn't my foster father. My foster dad was probably drunk off 40s and under the covers of our apartment 15 minutes away. But that thing had him down to a T, complete with the dirty flannel shirt he wore tonight. Marcus. What the fuck? He just raised his finger to his lips, until the thing was out of sight. We stayed in the storm drain for another 5 minutes in silence before he finally spoke. That's what I'm talking about. Things like that happen ever so often. My eyes still wide from what I just saw. Marcus grabbed the phone from me and called Bubbles. Within a matter of minutes we fell back to a car that we parked on the outskirts of the neighborhood and got out. The drive home was silent. But I had to know. Before I could even speak, Marcus replied, I don't know what they are. They usually don't come out very often, maybe twice, 3 times a night for the most. But it's rare. Bubbles and Jamal, the other spotter, looked at me in the rearview mirror of the car. How did it look like my foster father? I asked. Marcus looked confused. Your foster father? What do you mean? I described what I saw to him and he argued, nah, it looked like a giant clown. But then Bubbles interrupted. You both wrong. It looked like a giant dog. Jamal just sat quietly in the front passenger seat. That's when we all realized that we each saw something differently. The guys dropped me off home, careful to make an extra circle around the block just in case. Marcus said, I've been going to school and work as usual since then. I've been asked by the other guys to come out on a few more licks. To be honest, the thrill of robbing is fun and the money is easy, but I don't know anymore. Maybe if we switch up where we do it. But for now I don't know. I just don't know. Posted by you/Shane, star 93. Never call your children's names in the rainforests of Trinidad. I'm 78 years old, sitting, waiting for death in a part of a Florida hospital, hooked up to machines and monitors which are supposed to keep me alive, but ironically makes me feel more dead than anything else. I don't have a whole lot of time left, but these past few days after chemotherapy, I've had a lot of time to think and reflect on my memories of my earlier life, in a different time and a different place. There was nothing particularly outstanding about my life. With time and age, I've forgotten most of the irrelevant parts of it, but as I lay here, one particular incident from my childhood stands out to me with frightening clarity, that even now as a geriatric it makes me shut my eyes and clench my fists, wishing it was only a bad dream. I was born on the island of Trinidad, in the Caribbean, relatively small, but wealthy in oil and other resources. This was back in the 50s, before Trinidad was even a country of its own. Just another British colonial possession in the Caribbean. At the time infrastructure wasn't very well developed, but I lived with my parents in the capital of Port of Spain, which was much more industrialized than the countryside, where my grandmother lived. One summer, when I was 10 years old, my father, an engineer, decided it would be a good opportunity for me to visit his mother, my grandmother, at her house in Sangre Grande, a largely rural area in the eastern part of the island. I had only heard of her every now and again, and usually through arguments between my parents. My mother wasn't particularly fond of Eunice Charles, or Mammy Eunice she was known in Creole by the family. My mother, an educated, progressive-minded woman of her time, was fiercely opposed to Mammy Eunice's superstitions and traditional view of family life. Even though they met in person only a total of 3 times for the most, my mother couldn't stand her, so when my father hatched the idea of sending me to visit her during our school vacation, she was less than pleased. I remembered the night before I left, our sizable apartment in the city was in uproar. "You're sending him to stay with that old bat in the bush for an entire month, Wendell? What if a snake bites him? Or he falls off a cliff? She can't take proper care of him," my mother hissed. "Would you calm down? I'm only taking him there for 2 weeks and I'll be stationed at the tracking center in Arima. That's less than an hour away by car. If anything happens I'll be there quickly enough," my father retorted. "I still don't like this. What if she poisons my child? He isn't accustomed to that kind of countryside food they eat. He is such a delicate boy. Which is why this trip is perfect for him, Sandra. A couple weeks in the country outside of this hellhole of a city will do him some good. The country is changing, it would be good for him to experience at least some of the things I did as a child before it becomes wasteland," my father said. I listened through the walls. I don't know why my mother and Mammy Yun had such a bad relationship. One of my older relatives told me it was because of something that happened when Ma was still pregnant with me. I never really questioned it, but it was strange hearing my mother talk about her mother-in-law like that. I had never heard her raise her voice like that before, so hearing it was strange. The next day my dad loaded up his car and we were on our way out of the city heading towards God alone knows what. We spent close to 3 hours driving on some of the worst roads in the country at the time. Over time the asphalt from the city turned to dirt, then to mud, and eventually what I can only describe as sod. The telephone lines were replaced by towering palms and coconut trees, and I wondered how a woman as old as my grandmother lived life in a place so remote. The villages were spread far and apart with only a few huts, dotting the lush green ocean of trees that was eastern Trinidad. The nearest neighbors were about 20 minutes away, and with no telephone lines and very few vehicles, you could end up dead from something as mundane as food poisoning or a stub toe that got infected. I began wondering about what my mother said and had immediate reservations about coming here. What did I know about this woman besides the fact that she held me once when I was a few days old? My father, who was quiet the entire drive, must have seen the look of concern on my face and spoke up. "I know this is a new experience for you, but trust me, this will be good for you. Getting some time away from your mother and I will be great. You'll get to see some streams and breathe some of the freshest air on the island. I can remember playing in the forests up on that side for hours when I was your age. Just don't go too far inside." "Yay, I know snakes," I said softly. "Yay, snakes, and other things." My father's face immediately turned from happy and nostalgic to concerned. I noticed his brow tensed. He only did that when he was in deep thought or considering a punishment for me. In hindsight, it was one of the strangest things I had seen. After a few more minutes of driving, we finally reached a dirt track leading to a little cottage with sheets of galvanized for a roof. An old woman was sitting on a small wooden bench on the gallery outside, and she waved us to come inside. "That's your Granny Yoon," he said as he smiled. "You grew up here?" I asked. "Yep, some of the best years of my life," he said without taking his eyes off of the house. "Baby boy. Look how big you get. Oh my lord, I missed you so much," the woman said as she threw 2 frail arms around my father's shoulders, holding him in a tight embrace. She was the stereotypical black Caribbean granny, wearing a long blouse with a multicolored head wrap on. Looking back, there were no particularly distinguishing features. I could describe only that she was old, even by my understanding of age right now. Looking back, Mammy Yoon was probably pushing 90 by the time of the visit. "This must be the big man. I ain't seen you since you was a little one with your mammy," she said. "Yay, he'll be staying with you here for the next couple of weeks. It will be good to get to know each other. Plus he's never been out of the city," my father said. "Is that so? Well, we have lots to see on this side, Mr. City Boy. I can't wait for you to come and go for a trail walk with me," she said. Even at her age, I could see how spritey and full of life she was. Looking back, her courage and spirit were just a few of the things I admired about her the most. After a cup of cocoa and some catching up, my dad got back into his antique Chevy, leaving me behind. Mammy Yun took me to my room, which had a gorgeous view of the Sangre Grande horizon. In the distance I could hear monkeys chattering and parrots squawking. I had never seen so many trees in one place before, and it was a welcome change from the dismal gray buildings and traffic congestion of the city. "When you're done unpacking, you can walk around downstairs, but don't stray too far. You'll like it here, I just know it," she said warmly before setting off to get dinner started. I slipped into a pair of shorts and button-up t-shirt before heading downstairs. I walked around in the yard and saw there was no fence separating Mammy Yun's house from the forest. I walked around the towering trees and saw large, colorful fruits hanging from the trees, some of which I recognized and others I did not. While walking, I continued to hear the sounds of the forests. A few toads, some monkeys overhead, a squawk I can only imagine a parrot made, until I walked a little distance away and came upon dead silence. It was odd, not even the breeze seemed to rustle the leaves and branches in this part, and there was a hot, heavy presence in the air. The only way I could describe it was being on a packed bus at midday. But there was no one besides me around. I was about to investigate further when I heard a bell ringing in the direction of Mammy Yun's house. I walked over and saw her ringing the bell in the gallery. I thought this was odd. As old as she was, I'm sure she could have still called me. I wasn't that far away. "I'm back. How come you didn't just call me in?" I asked. "We don't call the names of the children when they're out in the bush. It invites things to follow them," Mammy Yun said curtly before inviting me into the house. "Things like what?" Certainly it couldn't be the parrots or the monkeys I saw out there. I was genuinely confused at this point, but I decided not to press any further, at least not until after dinner when we would have more time to chat. It was at that point I realized my grandmother was a woman of many strange quirks and customs. Taking her shoes off at the front door, throwing a pinch of salt over her shoulder when cooking. Even her almost 10-minute-long grace before meals prayer in Creole was something to note. Dinner was nothing short of perfect. While lounging around the living room, I saw my mother had a small bookcase near her rocking chair. It looked ancient and was made of shiny black wood. I remembered the bookcase particularly well because out of everything in her house, it was the only thing that seemed to shine, as if polished. On it were different versions of the Bible, a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu holy book, and various other leather-bound hard-covered books with what appeared to be scarlet red pages. Those ones particularly interested me because I couldn't remember seeing books that size before. They were about twice the thickness of the old Bible Mama Yun was reading near her oil lamp right now. "You looking at the books over there?" she asked over his shoulder, not even having to take her eyes off of the page she was reading. I felt a little nervous. I didn't want her to think that I was prying on her just one day into my visit. "It's okay. I imagined you're very curious. I don't think your mother and father would have spoken a lot about me over at your house," she said slowly. I walked over to her and asked, "What are all those books?" She studied my face beside the orange glow of the lamp before answering. "Knowledge of the spiritual. I'm a Catholic by birth, but it's good to read about other people's cultures and experiences with the other plane. As far as I can see, they all hold a little bit of truth in each page." I found it so profound. My grandmother had such an open mind. On more than one occasion I heard my mother refer to her as a senile old bat, but this interaction was refreshing. Suddenly the old cabin wasn't as menacing as it was, as Mama Yun began giving me details on her own background. How her parents were plantation hands who could trace their ancestry back to Cameroon. How she married a drunken mule cart driver, who squandered their savings, leaving only this house for her after his death. How my father got a scholarship to go abroad and furthered his life, and how despite his repeated pleas to move her to somewhere more civilized, she refuses to go. My heart and soul is in this land. It has so much beauty and happiness out here in these fields and forests. But at the same time there is some wickedness too. Not a lot, but just a little bit, she said. I could see a look of worry wash over her face in the flicker of the orange flame. The way the shadows cast over her eyelids made her look sad. That's when I remembered what she told me when I first came in from my walk. "Mammy Yun, what did you mean when you told me that calling my name might invite something in with me?" She kept her head in the same position. I thought with age her hearing would have deteriorated and she didn't hear the question, so I began to repeat it before she interrupted. I heard you the first time. Child, you might not know it, but there's a lot of evil in this world, and just how it have good things to help us and guide us, there is the bad that tries to distract us and keep us scared. Out in that bush has some of those things, and hearing your name is only giving them too much information. I sat listening to her with wide eyes. Most of my life my mother told me the superstitions of ghosts was just nonsense. In the city with our cars and electric lights, it was easy to dismiss these fears with the flick of a switch, as easy as the light would push back the shadows. But out here, Mammy Yoon's slow words had an airy quality I just couldn't shake, not even with all the lights in the world. These is spirits you're talking about? They live in the bush? I asked. Yes, boy. They live out there. Some of them take the physical fleshy form of some nasty little things. Human-animal hybrids. The worst is the dunes. Them is the spirits of the babies that was never baptized. They walk around with their feet back turned to show they progressing backwards with age. I raised one eyebrow at the thought of this. I wasn't very versed on folklore, so this was the first I have ever heard of the dunes. Have you ever seen one? I asked. Nah. Years ago there was a woman that used to live in another village. She used to walk down to the river to wash her clothes, and on her way back she saw a basket with what she thought was a baby inside crying. She wanted to know what beast would abandon a helpless child on a dirt track in the bush, so she picked it up and decided to carry it home. A little ways down the road she started to feel the basket getting heavier and heavier in her arms, until she couldn't carry it no more, and the baby's cries was replaced with a deep masculine voice that told her, "You better put me back where you find me." Well, child, she dropped the basket with whatever was in it and took off down the road and never looked back. In the end it took 2 doctors and a priest to try and calm her down, but she ain't never been right up here since, Mammy Yoon said as she tapped the side of her head. As unsettling as this story was, even at my age I was still skeptical. The eyewitness account of one obviously traumatized woman who probably didn't have a proper education wasn't enough to convince me of what was going on. Do you believe that? I asked timidly. She turned and I could see what looked like anger in her eyes. The warm maternal presence was gone and her mood shifted entirely. What you mean if I believe that? Boy, even though I wasn't there, I see some things in this life, eh? Your father could tell you too. He might pretend he forget or don't know, but trust me, he remember. I thought of my father's facial expression on the way here when he described his own experiences. It was weird, and clearly both he and Mammy Yoon weren't giving me the whole story. I was curious, but she wasn't in the mood to answer much more of my questions. It's getting late. You should go and sleep. I'll wake you for breakfast tomorrow. We can take that walk. Wash up and say your prayers. I felt like I now had more questions than answers. I lay awake listening to the breeze blow across the branches of the trees outside. A few forest noises and what might have been the trickle of a few streams, but nothing else, as I lay awake in bed thinking about what Mammy Yoon told me and trying to piece together from my early childhood memory what could have been responsible for such apprehension and strangeness from both her and my father. Sleep came, but it was heavy and restless. I woke up with a headache the following day, covered in sweat, to see the first rays of light peeping through the window. I heard movement in the kitchen downstairs and went down to see Mammy Yoon cooking breakfast. After a surprisingly quiet breakfast, we washed up the wares and got ready for the hike. By this time, the sun was just a little bit over the horizon and bathed the entire forest in a lovely, green gold hue. I sometimes remember that glow on my days in this old gray building of death, and I yearn for it. Right now it only exists in my mind. During the walk, Mammy Yoon showed me some of the native plants and what they were used for. Everything from treating urinary tract infections, fever, to even a quick poison. It was very educational until we reached a clearing in the forest. You know, your father had a brother? Of all the things I was expecting her to say, that was not one of them. I was about to ask her to repeat. I was so sure I didn't hear what she said when she continued. His name was Warren. He was a year younger. I never heard of my father mentioning siblings of any kind, so this was a shock. Years ago, when they were about your age, they were out here playing, exploring, and they got lost. We thought they just lost track of time, but we eventually found your father. He was petrified. Eventually all the men and boys in the village gathered up torches and lights to go look for Warren. We even got help from some officers who had trucks to drive through those dirt roads. We must have looked through them bushes for weeks, months even, before they eventually gave up. I could only listen and watch as the first drops of tears run down her wrinkled cheeks. We thought he just died and was never found until your father finally spoke up and told us what happened while they were out there. He said the dunes appeared around them, one by one in a circle, and started playing with them. He said from the top half they seemed like normal children. They couldn't see their feet because of the underbrush in the forest, but they got to a clearing like this, when they saw their twisted legs and tried to run. That's when they grabbed my sons. Your father said he fought to get away and ran back but left Warren behind. They take my child, she yelled, into the forest before her voice descended into sobs. I was dumbfounded. If what my grandmother was saying, I had an uncle who disappeared in these bushes decades ago. No wonder my mother was apprehensive about me coming here. But with something as traumatic as that incident, why would my father allow it? No. Encourage it? I still had my skepticism about this whole issue. Ghost children didn't abduct my uncle. Rural areas like these I reasoned had more than enough ways to die without the supernatural being involved, so I quickly dismissed the idea. But if that was the case, well then why was his body never found? Drowned in a river was one thing, but on an island as small as Trinidad one was bound to find the dead body of a child sooner or later. In the end I could only arrive at the conclusion that none of this made any sense. Mammy Yun composed herself before looking at me still emotional and said, "Don't worry. Just stay near the house and you'll be safe. This is still a good place." I wasn't so sure anymore. In my 10-year-old brain there was a mask over this part of the country. One I only got fleeting glimpses of in moments like these. We walked back to the house in silence. While my grandmother prepared lunch, I decided to do some exploring on my own. I thought a few wildflowers and fruits would be enough to console my grandmother from having to recount such an ordeal earlier, so I wandered into the track much further than I should have in search of some wild orchids. Before long, the sounds of the forest came under a heavy silence. No parrots, monkeys were around. Even the wind seemed to avoid this particular patch of trees. I thought about what could have caused this when suddenly I felt dizzy. It was strange. I wasn't hungry nor was I even moving, I just felt disoriented without literally doing anything. When I found my footing I saw in the distance some matted black hair poking out from behind a log. I looked closer and realized it was a little boy. He didn't seem to be lost, in fact he seemed quite comfortable out here. Maybe it was the neighbor's child, but the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away and I doubt anyone would walk this far up the road. When the boy thing turned, I felt my stomach sink as my entire world was turned upside down. Instead of a pair of normal legs, the boy's toes were facing backwards as both legs appeared to be sickeningly twisted at the kneecaps. He turned his face and I saw his face, horribly distorted as his eye sockets sagged and lips trembled, uttering something that resembled hoop, hoop, hoop. It screeched louder as it got closer, its backwards legs not slowing it down as it scuttled towards me. As terrified as I was, I remember whispering "Oh God," beneath my voice just before turning to run. I couldn't bear to turn around and see how close that thing was to me, but I could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling with that awful hoop hoop sound just behind me. Pure fear coursed through my body as I leapt over branches and tree buttresses to get away. In the distance I could hear Mammy Yun calling me towards the edge of the tree line. I raced towards her as I gradually heard the footsteps and sounds fade away behind me. I burst out of the bushes with such a force Mammy Yun jumped back. "Boy, where was you? You know how long I ringing this damn bell?" I was. Before she continued, she saw the look of fear and bewilderment on my face. "Oh God, you okay?" she asked as she wrapped her arms around me. "They real?" I could only say between pants and sobs. She led me inside and tried to soothe me. Apparently what I thought was only a few minutes in the forest was actually 3 hours. By the time I was inside, the sun already began to dip below the horizon, leaving behind an eerie, orange-blue glow in the clouds. "We don't have any phone here and it's too late to go down to the store, so I'll call your father to come pick you up first thing tomorrow." "Oh God, the same thing I didn't want to happen," she lamented. I couldn't eat a bite at dinner. I kept thinking about that thing's face. How distorted it seemed in its legs. A shudder ran up my spine and I felt my stomach turn again. Before long I went up to bed. I tried to think of the things I liked: cricket, coconut water, fishing with my friends, anything to get my mind off of that thing, but to no avail. So if these things were real and they were responsible for my uncle's disappearance, what did they do to him? Was he their prisoner? Was he eaten by them? Why have none of these things ever been captured? I know they were supposed to be ghosts, but what I saw this afternoon looked oddly physical enough. These thoughts did not bring back rational thinking, they erased it. Then it occurred to me, during my escape in the bush, Mammy Yun was calling me. She called my name. Unlike the night before, I couldn't hear any wind brushing against the treetops, no forest animals, not even the streams seemed to make any noise. I had just reached for the oil lantern on the nightstand when I saw a dark figure leap through the open window in a flash. Straight through the window and onto my bed. It landed on top of my chest. It was one of those things. Despite its relatively small, lean frame, it was strong and sinewy. Its slanted eyelids had no eyes underneath, they were just empty sockets as I could see its mouth making the hoop noises. I was terrified beyond belief as it began strangling me with its dirty, hard hands. When I was forced to look at its hideous face. Then it shocked me when it spoke in a deep tone. "I know you would have come back, Wendell. I know that I would have gotten you eventually." How did this thing talk? How did it know my father's name? I could feel myself losing consciousness just as Mammy Yun burst into the room. Shouting psalms in French Creole, she was armed with nothing but her heavy black Bible in one hand and a machete in the other. "You not going and get another one, you wicked thing!" she screamed. The thing began cursing before releasing me and jumping through the window back into the darkness. I eventually slipped into unconsciousness after that. I have faint memories of my grandmother carrying me to her room and rubbing my chest and neck with eucalyptus and other sweet-smelling oils, before eventually holding me close and rocking me to sleep. I awoke the next morning. After another silent breakfast, my grandmother took me to the nearest supply store where she called my father. I waited outside as she instructed him to come and get me. During the conversation, I heard her use the words, "emergency" and a repeat, before she eventually hung up. In about 30 minutes I saw my father's car pulling up the driveway of the store. "I really wished your stay could have been better," Mammy Yun said before pulling me in for a hug. She looked and sounded so sad. "I know, I just don't know what to say, Mammy. Just, thanks," I said softly. She let me go as I hurried over to the front seat. My father looked about 10 years older as Mammy Yun brought my father up to speed on everything that happened. His look of fear was quickly replaced with sorrow when he looked back at me in the passenger side seat. I never saw my father cry before that day, and I never saw him cry again after. It was a powerful image that moved me to tears as well. Before long I saw my father walk back over to the car and without saying anything put the car in drive and began reversing out of the driveway. I saw Mammy Yun raise her hand and gave me a wave. I returned it, knowing this would be the last I ever saw her again. The 3-hour drive back to Port of Spain was excruciatingly silent. On at least 3 dozen occasions I wanted to start a conversation with my father about what happened, about what he saw growing up. About something. He only spoke once, as he approached our house, and it is something that stays with me now even as a decomposing old man. "He was your age, Warren. They took him in that forest and never let him go. They wanted me too. I don't know why, but they came on the night your mother was pregnant and we were in Sangre Grande. It came and offered me Warren back in return for you. I couldn't help it. I was so overcome with fear and raw primal emotion while sitting, my throat burned and I felt my eyes water. Why did you send me? If you knew they wanted me?" I asked. He replied without looking at me, "I wanted to know if they would keep the promise," he said softly. I sat in silence. In the days that followed, the years that followed, my father and I spoke less and less to each other. About 2 years later I heard Mammy Yun died of a heart attack while walking down to the corner store. She was 102 and still full of life and energy. The entire family had her buried in Sangre Grande under special rites as per her last request. I did not attend. A few years after that I passed my last secondary school examinations and earned a scholarship to study medicine in Florida, where I met my wife and got married. Despite repeated pleas from my mother to come back to Trinidad, I never did. But I did move her to the US with my family when my father died. I can't even remember our final conversation, only that he ended it with how sorry he was. Posted by u/Shane, star 93. A man in a costume is pretending to be my mom's dog. I haven't heard from my mom in about 3 days. That was around the time her beagle Buster died and she was really depressed, so I decided to give her some space to cope. So when she called me out of the blue yesterday sounding all bright and chipper, that was when I knew something had happened. We live in small town Iowa, a couple kilometers north of Spirit Lake. There isn't much to do to pass the time, and since my dad died and I moved out for college, Mom relied heavily on Buster for company. I finished up my last semester and went back home ready to fit back into life, at least until it was time to go job hunting, and that's when she told me the news about Buster. I tried my best to console her and even promised to get her a new dog, but she wouldn't hear a word of it. Buster was a gift from my dad for their 12th anniversary, so to her, Buster was the last thing that made sense to her, and losing him meant losing my dad all over again. I spent a few nights at her house to try and cheer her up before getting back to my own apartment about 10 minutes away until I got her phone call. The sun hadn't even risen properly above the horizon when I heard my phone rattling on the nightstand. "Mikey. You need to get over here right now. You wouldn't believe who came to visit me last night." I had just woken up from a deep sleep and her loud, energetic tone was a little overwhelming for me. "Who?" I done. "Buster. He must have come in through the doggy door. Although I don't know how because he's so big now." I paused for a minute trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I looked at the phone screen to make sure it was my mom and glanced at the time to see it was just 5:05 a.m. "Are you sure it isn't another beagle? Could be someone else's dog." "Of course it's him. I'd know my Buster anywhere. Come over and say hi." I wanted to ask more but between my sleepy haze and obvious confusion all I managed was, "Oh, okay." I looked at my phone screen again unsure if what just happened was a really vivid dream or if my mom had fallen into some psychotic episode. I put on a sweater and slipped on my jeans and sneakers before leaving for her house. All the while over I was genuinely worried about her mental health and I blamed myself. Dad died around the same time I started school out of state and he was barely in the ground when I up and left Mom on her own. The more I thought about it the more likely it seemed that I was the one to blame for all of this and to make matters worse I still didn't have a job. As I bent the corner I half expected to see Buster running around our front lawn as I had seen him before so many times walking home from high school but there was no dog. Probably inside. I walked up the cobblestone walkway and heard Mom making her ridiculous baby talk that I'd often hear when Buster was still alive. As I walked in through the front door nothing could prepare me for what I saw as my eyes focused the room I saw Mom sitting on the couch as I had seen her 100 million times before with a black mass curled at her feet. As my eyes adjusted to the light of the house I stood frozen unable to say anything. "Doesn't he look great, Mikey?" What I saw was a man, 6 feet 8 inches fuck me. He could have been closer to an even 7 feet tall from where I stood wearing a matte black dog mask and full body jumpsuit. The man was so tall he almost completely covered the white carpet Mom had laid out on the ground. "I don't know where he was but I'm so happy to have my big man back," Mom said as she pat the man's stomach. I still couldn't move or say anything. Through the eye holes of the mask I could see the man studying me intently and a pang of fear struck my chest. He looked as if he was plotting his next move. Thinking of what to do. What did I just stumble upon exactly? I shifted my gaze to my mom and saw that she was in her glee. The only time I saw her this happy was when I told her I got accepted to Nebraska State. It felt so sincere and warm it tore me up inside. Then I looked back down to the man and looked at his eyes again through the holes of his mask. I could only see his eyes but I swore they had the most smug look as if to say, "Yay, I made her this happy when you couldn't." But of course he didn't say anything. He was a dog after all. Dogs don't talk. My God. I had to say something. "Mom, what the fuck?" I blurted out. Of course that's not exactly the words I wanted to come out but the shock of the situation sort of chose my words for me. She raised her head and the warm, doting smile melted from her face. "What's your problem? Buster's back, can't you see?" "Mom, who is that? Where did he come from?" Mom looked back at me like I had a skull full of shit. "This isn't funny, Mikey. You're scaring Buster with your loud talking." My mom wasn't much of a prankster. Come to think of it, she wasn't much of anything. For as long as I could remember she pretty much lived for her family. Whatever Dad and I liked, she liked as well, but I still held out hope that this was some elaborate joke at my expense. But her eyes and facial expression behind her comically tiny, Looney Tunes glasses made me realize that something was terribly wrong. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse I heard it. Whimpers coming from the thing that lay on the ground. "Aw, what's wrong, Bussy? Wanna go out? You don't? Okay, well stay inside with Mama." I could feel beads of sweat forming below my hairline in clusters. I didn't know what to do. Do I call the police? Clearly my mom was unwell if she felt this. Thing was her dead dog. Then without warning the man got up on all fours and started growling at me. I felt that pang of fear in my chest again. Harder this time. I clearly couldn't count on my mom for help. So what was I going to do? The man in this suit looked like he had at least 50 pounds on me and he was clearly deranged. "Buster, come back here. Leave Mikey alone. He just wants to play with you, Mikey. He hasn't seen you for so long." Then I could see him tensing up as if to charge. Before waiting I ran out the open door and back onto the street, not stopping until I got home. As I type this now it seems ridiculous me running from a grown man in a dog costume, but I don't know. There was something so unsettling about the incident. Clearly it was a man dressed as a dog, but I don't know. His eyes, while they were definitely human, had something else behind them that seemed inhuman and animalistic. I walked back over to my apartment trying to make sense of what happened all the way. Who was that person? Where did he come from? Was he dangerous? But last and definitely not least, what do I do now? Do I go to the police? Tell them my mom's home has been invaded by a crazed dog man? Even if I did convince them to come to the home with me, what would they have done? I read a story online once where a man out of some strange fetish decided to live out the rest of his days as a horse in California with his wife, now owner, and there wasn't anything the authorities could do about it. Even if the police did something, is that really what I wanted to put my mom through? Between Dad's death and my going away, she clearly had a lot of mental baggage, and a trip to the police station to file a report, assuming she would in the first place, was the last thing she needed. But still, leaving her in there with whatever the fuck that was wasn't a solution either. I sat on my bed and thought for a while until I realized I had to do something. I walked back over to Mom's house. The front door still open. Still unsure of how to approach the situation, I pulled out my pocket knife in case things took a turn for the worse. That's when I saw one of my old neighbors, Miss Johansson, in her patio looking in the direction of my house. I whistled her over to the sidewalk, careful not to make too much noise for my mom or Buster to notice. "Mikey, is your mom okay?" Why do you ask?" She studied me carefully. "Well, she's been laughing and giggling really loud, and just before I saw you she started cursing at someone. I know she lives alone since you left, so I don't know what's going on. Maybe she had the TV on? The thing is, it's not just that. Last night I got up to use the washroom and through the window I saw a huge dog in your front lawn. It was about the size of a Great Dane. I thought about calling animal control, but who would believe an old coot like me? Who would believe that? Indeed, I thought to myself. Thanks, Ms. Johansson. I think maybe you should call the police." Usually Ms. Johansson was the kind of old biddy to ask why, but she sensed the urgency of the situation and hurried inside to call the cops. No sooner had I turned back to face the house, I heard my mom scream. I hopped the wall of the house and walked inside to see the dog man trying to mount my mother as she fought back. I tried to focus on what was happening before my very eyes. His growls and snorts together with my mom's screams almost sent me crazy. My fear and shock quickly turned to rage when I folded out the blade from my pocket knife and threw myself at him at full speed. I crashed into him and took him down to the ground in a move reminiscent of my old Pop Warner days as I slipped the knife between his shoulder blades. I could hear him yelp in pain as I grabbed him and began punching the leather mask he was wearing. I heard his animalistic growls again as he lunged forward and bit my forearm. A bolt of pain ran up my right arm as I tried to pry his mouth open from the mask. "Mikey, what are you doing?" was all I could hear from behind me. This fucker was strong. I felt him trying to pull me closer with one arm, but I fought back with everything until I heard the police sirens. The most human look of fear washed over his eyes as he opened his mouth and ran on all fours out the open back door and over the neighbor's fence. I was bleeding everywhere and my mom wore a confused look on her face the entire time. When the police cleared the house and the neighborhood with no reports of a 7-foot-tall man, I wasn't particularly surprised. I deliberately left out the details of the dog suit. I didn't need the police looking at me side-eyed. We made a report as usual and investigators chalked it up to a homeless derelict who thought he could fit himself into Mom's home. It still didn't answer a lot of questions. For now, Mom is staying with me at my apartment. I have an appointment lined up with a psychiatrist for her the next morning. I love her so much and I just want to do what's best for her. What I should have done all along. I hope this whole episode is over. Reading it about a year from now it might seem a little less terrifying and a little more funny, but the growling I hear ever so often outside my door as I write this doesn't help ease my mind. Posted by you/Shane, star 93. I work at a wildlife reserve in Kenya. The animals are different after dark. I've loved certain things. Now the same things that have brought me joy and peace, I can't even stand to look at them. To think of them. Forgive me if the flow of the writing is staggered, but a lot has happened over the past 24 hours and I'm still in the process of collecting my thoughts, much more my words. I'm a warden for one of Kenya's larger game reserves, whose name will be withheld for obvious legal and professional reasons. As a Briton, I've been in the country for the past year, shuffling between administrative duty to field work with some of the more experienced guys. I enjoyed the fresh air, strong breeze and open plains, and above all the animals. Mention wildlife reserve to the average person and it conjures up images of snarling big cats or charging rhinos, but not to me. In the time I've been here, the most danger I've faced was skinning my all too pale knees on the bark of a tree where I tried to install a trail camera. Not that I was afraid of the animals. Growing up in Kent, Attenborough documentaries was the closest I could get to the African savannas, and I simply could not get enough. Between my father's drinking and my mom leaving the family, I found peace in the rolling plains of the Serengeti and the peaks of Kilimanjaro. Where people would tremble at the sight of lions and leopards, I was in awe, and as corny as it might sound, I used to imagine they were my friends. After all, there weren't many I could turn to. I loved all the creatures. At least until last night. For the 12 months I've been here, all of my duties and errands never required me to remain on the reserve after dark. I never thought much of it. I usually began work around 7 a.m., making routine patrols, doing the occasional site visit, head counts of animals together with rudimentary research for any visiting academics, so it made sense I would sign out well before sunset. Yesterday was different, however. Comminge, my supervisor, advised I come in for the late shift. "It's not something we normally do," he said. I could hear the unease in his voice. Comminge was an aging bureaucrat stuck in an underfunded, understaffed job with few perks and even fewer reasons to stick around. His dull, monotone voice had something else that morning. It was a tremble. "A few of the regulars on the night shift will be here by 6 p.m. to guide you. After that you're on your own, but it's pretty dull until morning relief arrives." I agreed, but the sound of Comminge's voice stuck with me even after hanging up. Maybe I imagined it. I had never met any of the night shift staff. They were supposedly the ones at most danger, not particularly from the animals but more from other people. Poachers were the biggest problem around here. Back in 2016, when IS was trying to stake a claim in East Africa, I heard of a few run-ins with a convoy of militants who tried to set up a supply line to the northeast of the reserve, but the last few years have been more or less quiet. For these reasons and more, we tried to keep a roster of at least 10 men on the night shift, with an additional 5 on standby, but budget cuts together with the pandemic has forced us to do more with less, meaning make the most of 5 guys at most. I packed what I thought I would need, including an expensive night vision camera I thought I would never get to use. I felt a creeping dread about taking up the night shift. Poachers and terrorists aside, I felt as if I wasn't being told a lot of what I was getting into, and that made me ask questions I realized I never asked before. Most notably, how come I never saw any of the night staff since I was the first one at the reserve for the morning shift? I pushed these things to the back of my mind to stay focused on the task at hand. Even though I didn't necessarily have a fear of the animals, it was a line of work that demanded focus at all times, even more so after dark, I would imagine. I got to the reserve just as the sun dipped below the horizon. There I met a grizzled-looking man decked in green safari fatigues who introduced himself as Anthony. Wrinkles spread across his face like a map of Kenya. He gave me a firm shake and introduced me to Lamwani and Siranka. This was the night shift. They seemed a bit more rougher than the usual day staff. A few times while speaking with the guys, I noticed Anthony looking at me, almost studying me out of the corner of his eyes. I thought it was strange, then realized that being new to the job, he was probably skeptical of having me on as a supervisor. I tried not to think much of it. I was a new face after all and wasn't exactly sure of what lay ahead, but tried to approach it with the same professionalism I always did. How wrong I was. Anthony explained that unlike daytime duties, I would spend a lot more time driving around the trails of the reserve with the other guys in a jeep. Only Siranka would stay behind at our outpost. The purpose of this, he said, was to ensure the animals were, as he said, in good order. This confused me a bit. Usually the animals managed well without our help. This was after all their home, and there were enough herds and packs around to ensure they looked after each other. Anthony must have seen the confused look before explaining. "Just look at them. Nothing more, don't get close." Even with the advice, I saw a look of concern wash over his face. It was the look of someone realizing that they got the wrong man for the job. By 9 p.m. we drove to the southernmost portion of the reserve. Anthony turned off the lights and killed the engine of the jeep. There we sat in darkness and silence for almost 3 minutes before I tried to crack a joke to break the tension. "Quiet," he instructed. No sooner had he said that I heard it. About 100, maybe 140 meters away was the sound of something, a shrill cry that seemed to rattle the hood of our jeep. I almost leapt out of the seat before I felt a strong palm grip my wrist. "Relax," Anthony said in the same voice as he would say good evening. Shortly after I heard a cry of zebras, only they didn't sound quite right. It's difficult to explain, but it almost sounded like something pretending to be a zebra. Anthony muttered something to Lamwani, who was in the back seat. I heard him radio back to Siranka at the outpost. "We're heading over to the source of the sound," he said as he turned the keys in the Jeep as the engine roared to life. I still wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing out here, as Lamwani handed us headlamps as we drove towards the strange sounds. We stopped and killed the lights and engine of the Jeep before venturing through a narrow dirt track lined with dry shrubs. "Have you ever used a gun before?" Anthony asked. I struggled to answer it. My work never required it, I was a field researcher after all. "Forget it, just stay close to us," he coldly instructed. After about 5 minutes of walking we came to a clearing and that's where I saw them. A herd of zebras, only not quite. Between the darkness and poor vision of the night my brain hurt trying to make sense of what I saw before me. Zebras, or what looked like zebras. They looked corrupted. I saw a zebra with a pair of human eyes and a mouth that seemed too big for any animal, his lips peeled back into an unnatural grin. His eyes, I felt his gaze settle on me and a cold, hot burning on me. There were others, another zebra's mouth opened up not on his head where it should be but beneath his neck, his head hanging limply behind like some abominable Pez dispenser. A headless zebra strutted along calmly as another walked upright on 2 legs like a human. I felt a chill seeing this, my dinner churned in my stomach seeing this and hearing their laughs and noises. Suddenly Anthony's voice shook me. "Don't take your eyes off of us," he scolded, but before I could obey I heard a noise behind me. I whipped around to see what it was only to find nothing. In the time it took me to do that, Anthony and Lamwani were gone. It was impossible, they were an arm's length away from me and I only turned for a second, maybe even less, yet they were nowhere to be seen. I saw the zeb. The thing strutting towards me and ran. The flow of my headlight barely lighting the way, across dirt and rocks as I ran across the savannah. What the fuck did I get myself into? I tried to retrace my steps back to the Jeep but it was no use. Between the running and the darkness I was perfect lost. My legs were burning, my chest hurt. What were those things? I felt like I was being punished. I felt for my radio only to realize it fell out. I avoided the trees knowing that's where the leopards on the plains took their rest and I didn't want to replace one problem with another. I ducked behind a nearby shrub hoping to wait out what I saw. After a short while I heard my name. I knew Saranka would have come to check on us. I was about to climb out of the shrubs when something seemed off. I wasn't being called by the name I introduced myself to Saranka and the other guys. I was being called by my other name. My real name. Then I realized the voice calling me didn't sound like Saranka's, in fact it didn't even sound Kenyan. It sounded British and I knew whose voice it belonged to, only the owner of the voice has been dead for years and buried in a British cemetery. It slurred with the sound of a man who had won too many scotch on the rocks, all while I hid from it in the bushes of a Kenyan savanna, the same way I hid from him when I was a child under my bed. A giraffe, only it wasn't really a giraffe, head sailing much longer than even a giraffe's head had any right being, both eyes missing, calling my name in the cold night. I felt a shudder quake across my body as this unnatural abomination trotted mere feet for me calling my name. I must have fell asleep in the bushes because when I woke up, the sun's rays were beginning to creep from over the horizon. I never felt so relieved before in my life. In the distance I saw the Jeep and made a run for it, but by that time the few animals I did glimpse seemed to be normal. I didn't take any chances as I pushed the gas back to the outpost where I was prepared to give a proper scolding to Saranka for not following the proper SOPs when it came to missing staff. Only no one was there. No Saranka and certainly no Anthony or Lamwani. I dialed Komanj immediately and he along with a few other senior officials visited the area within the hour. We alerted the proper authorities and I gave my statements to everyone who asked. I haven't been given the full picture as yet. To be honest, I don't even know if I want the full picture on what happened on that night. Those animals. Whatever they are, they were corrupted or worse yet, that's what they always were when the lights went out. Posted by you/Shane, star 93. I found something unimaginable while cleaning out my dad's house. Let me start by saying my father isn't dead. At least I don't think so. But I can see how the title might lead you to think that he is. To avoid confusing you any more than you probably already are, let me start at the beginning. My dad and I have had a pretty strong relationship. Ever since I was a child he was always very supportive of me, putting up with my rebellious phase and even allowing me to stay at home during those years of financial uncertainty we all face after graduating from college. Despite repeated calls for him to move in with me after Mom died a few years ago, he insisted he wanted to remain living out his days there. He was getting older and years of cigarettes and fast food were finally beginning to catch up with him. Being as close as I was to him, it really pained me to see his health failing the way it was. His glassy eyes a parody of the once intimidating stare he would give me when I misbehaved. Eventually I got a call from him a few days ago asking to stay with me for a while. He explained that after a recent fall in the bathroom his doctor recommended he stay with someone until he felt well enough to return home. Despite being almost 70, he had a lot of pride and insisted on not being a burden, so I was a bit surprised that he took his doctor's advice and relented in taking up my offer. Needless to say, he didn't need to ask twice. I even offered to pick him up at home but insisted on taking the bus over to my apartment to prove he ain't no baby, as he would often repeat. My apartment is in walking distance to the bus stop, so we caught up during the walk. He didn't have much going on. In typical dad fashion, he waxed light about gas prices, his annoyance with the new diet his doctor set for him, and his idea to get a dachshund puppy simply because he liked saying the word dachshund. I work in advertising, so most of my working hours is at home staring at my laptop screen, so I got to prepare meals and spend more time with him. Everything was going well for us. I was even contemplating how I should ask him to stay for good instead of returning to the old house. That was until the second night. In my job, I'm often required to meet and discuss new projects with overseas partners and branches, which requires me to be awake to accommodate those in different time zones. It might have been around 2 a.m. when my semi-conscious brain picked up on it through the headphones attached to the computer. At first I thought it might have been something from one of the other speakers on the Zoom call, but I realized no one else seemed bothered by it. Then I heard it again, this time louder. It was coming from the guest bedroom where Dad was supposed to be sleeping. As I got closer to the door I heard it even clearer. Why can't I see him then? The voice was old, much older than my father. If I had to chance a guess, the person that voice belonged to might have easily been pushing 100. Hoarse and rough like sandpaper, it was nothing like the sleepy, Midwestern drawl of my dad's voice. Confused and a bit concerned, I cracked the door to peep inside, only to see my dad snoring away under the quilt. At first it occurred to me that he could be pretend sleeping, but even if he was, what was the alternative? After standing in a dark bedroom, staring at my elderly dad sleep for about 3 minutes, I eventually chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. It wasn't a very satisfactory answer, but it was the only one I had. The next day pretty much went as expected. Dad ate his breakfast while I ran some errands. I considered asking him about the strange voice the night before, but eventually decided against it. I didn't want to give him the impression that I was hearing things or spying on him. That definitely wouldn't help my chances of him staying. I kept it to myself and convinced myself again that it was just my imagination running wild combined with lack of sleep. Until the second night. I was focusing on a PowerPoint presentation when I saw a shadow pass my door in the corridor outside my room. Naturally I would have thought it was Dad's going to use the toilet or grab a snack in the kitchen, except the shape of the figure that passed the door was much shorter. Dad is at least 5'10", this shadow was for the most part half the length of the doorway itself. I was wide awake this time. I paused before peeping around the corner in time to see my father. No. Not my father. My father. A miniature, child-sized version of him walking away from me. Same clothing he wore to bed a few hours ago, same thin, silvery strands of hair at the back of his head, walking away towards the bedroom. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I still can't understand what I am typing here. Eventually, after about 30 minutes of intense debate in my mind, I decided to open the door of the guest room and see for myself. There he lay, my dad, regular height and proportions, fast asleep. I must have stood there for about an hour staring at him snore and drool into his pillow before finding the courage to head to bed. It was hardly a restful night. Everything from extremely early onset of Alzheimer's to overwork and stress crossed my mind. As usual, everything was normal as ever the following morning. Dad plunked down in front of the television complaining about CNN, while I studied him from across the room over a cup of coffee. I wish I could tell you I saw his skin quiver like a costume or a second pair of eyes blink to give away some sinister alien form, but I would be lying if I did. The man muttering about politics in the couch in front of me was the same man who taught me about life and provided for me all those years ago. Most fears and jitters tend to seem ridiculous when the sun comes out, and this one was no different. I eventually overcame any initial apprehension and spoke with him about his night. It was restful with the exception of some mild headaches, but it eventually passed. Eventually he told me there was some medication at home he was supposed to be taking but forgot to bring with him. After a brief scolding for me on how to be more responsible, I agreed to run back to his house and grab it for him. I was happy to be out for a while. It gave me an opportunity to clear my head from work and put things in perspective. I got to the house I spent my childhood and saw the front yard covered in high grass and weeds. Because of Dad's health issues and the fact that he was at my place for the past 3 days, I didn't exactly expect a rose garden with a topiary lawn, but this was insane. From the looks of it, the yard wasn't tended to for at least 2 months. I walked past the mini Amazon jungle in front of my childhood home and used the key to unlock the weather-beaten brown door that was once beige, and the stench hit me almost immediately. Putrid and foul. I've read books that say the scent of a rotting corpse has a sweet undertone, but let me tell you, there was none of that in this situation. It was a raw, meaty smell that stimulates your most primal reflex to run. Laid out on the floor of the living room was the decomposing body of my father. Eyes bulging, head twisted perfectly around. I felt sick. My empty stomach turned. It turned from the foul stench, it turned from the dead body of my father, it turned from the fact that I don't know who or what is in my house right now. I need help.